For 878 years, the question of where the Sumerians came from had one fixed answer in every major textbook: nowhere. They were thought to have grown out of the local Ubaid farming groups that already lived in southern Iraq. The case was treated as closed. Then a Harvard geneticist named Joseph Lazaridis published ancient DNA from Shanidar Cave in Bestanur, in northern Iraq, the first pre-pottery Neolithic Mesopotamian gene maps ever read. What those gene maps contained quietly forced the field to start using a word it had refused to use before. How does a civilization that builds the first writing system, the first cities, the first irrigation networks, and the first organized governments in human history end up with no clear genetic starting point? That is what scholars eventually started calling the Sumerian problem. It was given that name in 1944 by a German expert on ancient Mesopotamia working in exile in Turkey, though the problem itself was at least 100 years older. Every other ancient civilization had a clear parent culture. The Egyptians had the Natufian farming groups of the Nile. The Greeks had the Mycenaeans before them. The Romans had the Etruscans and the Latins. The Chinese had the early Tu and Longshan. Each one could be traced back through pottery, language, burial customs, and everyday objects to an earlier group that clearly produced them. The Sumerians could not. Their language sat in a category of its own. Sumerian was a one-of-a-kind language with no known relatives, alive or extinct. It was not Semitic like the Akkadian that eventually replaced it. It was not Indo-European. It did not match the languages of Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Iranian Plateau, or the Indus Valley. By the time scholars had finished listing the world's known language families, Sumerian was the odd one out that did not fit on any branch of the tree. Their writing system appeared in southern Iraq sometime between 3,500 and 3,200 years before the Common Era. There was no early form, no proto-cuneiform development chain stretching back through picture writing into cave painting. The signs appear on clay tablets at Uruk almost fully formed, complete with an early number system that was already being used for accounting. Whoever invented it did not appear to be experimenting. Their religion was even stranger. The Sumerians did not believe they had created their own civilization. They were clear about this. According to their own texts, beings called the Anunnaki had brought everything to them: writing, mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, metalwork, animal husbandry, brewing, weaving, and law. The Sumerians called these gifts the Me. They believed they had received them at Eridu, their first city, and that the Anunnaki had come from somewhere else, not somewhere in Mesopotamia, but somewhere far away. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists treated all of this as religious storytelling. The texts were myth. The lack of earlier roots was assumed to be a sampling problem, a result of the fact that early Mesopotamian villages had been buried under thousands of years of sediment and modern cities. Someone would eventually find the parent culture if they dug deep enough. The Ubaid farming groups who lived in southern Iraq from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE were the leading candidates. They were already living in the same valley. They built the first temples at Eridu. They had domesticated grain and livestock. They appeared to be moving toward what would later become Sumer. That was the textbook answer. It was clean. It did not require explaining where anyone came from. And it held for almost 2 centuries. The first crack in that answer did not come from archaeology. It came from genetics, and it came from an unexpected direction. A research team based at the University of Pavia in Italy published a paper in BMC Evolutionary Biology with a deliberately classical title, In Search of the Genetic Footprints of Sumerians. The lead author was a geneticist named Nadia El-Zahiri. She had spent years building DNA collections from groups in southern Iraq, focusing on the marsh Arabs, the people who lived in the wetlands where the Tigris and Euphrates emptied toward the Gulf. The reason for this focus was straightforward. The marsh Arabs were considered by most archaeologists to be the closest living link to the original Sumerians. They lived in the same landscape. They built reed houses that matched the depictions in Sumerian art down to the bundle ties. They fished from the same kinds of boats, traveled the same channels, and kept traditions that local oral history traced back without interruption for thousands of years. If any modern group still carried the Sumerian genetic signal, it would be them. The Pavia team sampled 143 men, all of them with at least 4 generations of proven Marsh Arab ancestry. They studied both the Y chromosome, which traces the paternal line, and the mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line. The maternal side returned the expected mix of Middle Eastern lineages. The paternal side returned something far less expected. 74% of the men carried one Y chromosome lineage, a branch designated J1P0A8. That uniformity alone was striking. The Marsh Arabs were one of the most genetically homogeneous paternal groups in the entire region. But the more consequential finding was where that lineage showed its widest internal diversity, which is what geneticists use to estimate where a lineage originated. The lineage's core diversity did not sit in southern Iraq. It sat to the north, in upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Turkey, with smaller dispersal signals reaching toward Oman, the Ethiopian highlands, and the eastern Mediterranean. In plain terms, the main paternal lineage of the people most closely linked to the Sumerians did not appear to have originated where the Sumerians ended up. It looked as though it had moved in from somewhere else. This finding alone was not sufficient to overturn the established answer. The Pavia paper was carefully worded. The authors noted that the data fit several possible migration narratives and that more evidence would be required. But a question had been raised, and once raised, it could not be unasked. If the Marsh Arabs had moved into southern Iraq from outside the valley, when did they arrive? Did they arrive with the Sumerians or before them? And if before them, who exactly built the Ubaid temples at Eridu? For 11 years, those questions could not be properly answered. The technology to do so did not yet exist at the required resolution. Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia itself was almost entirely absent. The hot, dry climate of southern Iraq is harsh on bone and organic tissue. DNA degrades rapidly. Bones turn brittle. The kinds of samples that had transformed our understanding of European prehistory were simply not available from southern Mesopotamia. So the question waited. While the Sumerian problem sat unsolved, ancient DNA research was completing its first wave of discoveries across the rest of the Near East. Iranian Neolithic farmers had been sequenced from the Zagros Mountains in 2 separate papers. Anatolian farmers had been read from sites in southern Turkey. Levantine groups had been sequenced from Israel and Jordan. The Caucasus had been sampled. Cyprus had been sampled. By the early 2020s, geneticists could plot the genetic profile of every region surrounding southern Mesopotamia, every region except southern Mesopotamia itself. That gap closed when a single issue of the journal Science published 3 companion papers, all produced by an international team led by Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard, with David Reich, Ron Pinhasi, and Songul Alpaslan-Rudenberg as co-authors. The papers together analyzed more than 700 ancient genomes from across what the team called the Southern Arc, a stretch of land running from the Balkans through Anatolia and the Caucasus into the Levant and Mesopotamia. The time range covered 11,000 years, from the earliest Neolithic farming communities to the period following the Middle Ages. It was the largest ancient DNA study ever attempted in the Near East. Buried within the Anatolian paper was a section that, in retrospect, may have been the most quietly significant passage published in ancient DNA research that decade. The team had finally sequenced the first ancient DNA from pre-pottery Neolithic Mesopotamia. The samples came from 2 sites in northern Iraq: Bestanur, a Neolithic village dating to roughly 7,800 BCE, and Shanidar Cave, a site already famous since the 1950s primarily for its Neanderthal burials. The new genomes came from human remains found in layers above the Neanderthal levels, dating to the 9th and 8th millennia BCE. These were not Sumerians. The Sumerians would not appear for another 4,000 years, but these were the people who inhabited northern Mesopotamia during the formative period that produced the Ubaid farming groups, who in turn created the cultural framework into which Sumer would eventually be born. If any individuals were likely to be direct ancestors of the people the Sumerian problem concerned, it was these. That was only the surface result. When the Lazaridis team ran statistical clustering analyses on the Shanidar and Bestanur genomes, the results did not match the predicted pattern. The textbook model had anticipated that early Mesopotamian farmers should cluster genetically with their presumed direct ancestors, the pre-pottery Neolithic groups from the Levant. Given that the Levant was the closest known source of farming origins, they did not. The Shanidar and Bestinur samples landed in a distinct genetic position, somewhere between the Levantine farmers to the southwest, the Anatolian farmers to the northwest, and the Iranian Zagros herders to the east. They were a blend, and that blend included a substantial contribution from a region the standard textbook explanation had never required, the Iranian Zagros mountains, the same Zagros region whose inhabitants the Sumerians had been trading with for tin, copper, and lapis lazuli for thousands of years was now appearing inside the ancestry of the people who became their cultural predecessors. The Zagros herder lineage had been sequenced years earlier in papers led by Marcos Gallego Lorente and Farnaz Brushaki and colleagues. Those researchers had studied Neolithic remains from caves on the Iranian side of the border dating to around 8500 BCE. The genomes they recovered were genetically distinct from every other Neolithic population that had been sequenced in the region. The Iranian farmers carried a deep ancestry that did not intermix with the Anatolian or Levantine groups on either side of them. They were their own distinct lineage. Two of the three founding farming populations of the ancient Near East were genetically separate from one another. They lived approximately 300 kilometers apart. They did not intermix in any meaningful way for thousands of years, and then, sometime in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, that began to change. Iranian ancestry began to flow westward. By the time the individuals at Shanidar and Bestinur were buried, a measurable proportion of their genome traced back to the Zagros. By the time the Ubaid farming groups had established themselves in southern Iraq, that Zagros component had become a baseline ingredient of the regional population. By the time Sumer appeared, it was woven so deeply into the genetic foundation that geneticists could not isolate a distinct Sumerian genome from the wider Mesopotamian genetic background, even if they wished to do so. There was no separate Sumerian genome. There was a continuum of ancestry, and the Sumerians occupied a position along it. That was the word the field had previously refused to employ: admixed. In the coming years, when high-quality samples are recovered from sites such as Eridu and Tel al-Ubaid, that word will carry considerably more weight. The picture is converging on something the scholarship of Louis IV could not have envisioned. What makes the Zagros finding particularly striking is that the Sumerians themselves appear to have preserved a memory of it. The Sumerian texts are filled with references to a mountain origin. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest surviving Sumerian flood narratives, describes the first kings as having descended from a high country to the eastern edge of the world. The Sumerian king list, copied repeatedly across centuries, mentions an early ruling lineage at a place called Arata, which scholars have spent the better part of a century attempting to locate. The leading geographic candidates for Arata have consistently pointed toward the Iranian highlands, some placing it in the modern province of Kerman, others in the Zagros range itself. The trade goods associated with Arata in Sumerian poetry are mountain goods, carnelian, lapis lazuli, tin, copper, precisely the materials that flowed into Sumer from the east, not from the south or west. The Sumerian creation poem known as Enki and Ninhursag describes the gods establishing a sacred land at a place called Dilmun, somewhere toward the Gulf. But the deeper origin texts do not begin with Dilmun. They begin with mountains. The god Enki, who became the principal deity of Eridu, is repeatedly associated with underground water sources flowing from a distant highland region. The texts do not present this as metaphor. They present it as real geography. For most of the 20th century, scholars assumed these mountain references were poetic embellishments. The Sumerians had never lived in mountains. Their entire way of life was organized around flat river plains and irrigation infrastructure. Why would their origin narratives consistently point eastward and upward? The genetic evidence offers a coherent explanation. Because part of them came from there, the timing of that gene flow is almost too precise to ignore. The Iranian ancestry signal does not appear randomly across Mesopotamian genomes. It appears within a specific window. Researchers working with the Lazaridis data have estimated the major influx of Zagros ancestry into Upper Mesopotamia at somewhere between 9,000 and 7,500 years before the present. That timing is significant. It overlaps almost exactly with the period during which the first year-round farming villages of the Upper Tigris Valley were transitioning from seasonal encampments into permanent settlements. The Ubaid culture, the proposed ancestral group for the Sumerians, would emerge from those villages roughly 1,500 years afterward. In other words, the gene flow into Mesopotamia from the Zagros occurred just before the Ubaid culture began to take shape. The very group that the textbooks treated as the indigenous root of Sumer was itself a recent blend of older populations. It was not local in the way that textbooks had assumed. It had absorbed a major Eastern component only a few generations before it began, constructing temples and irrigation systems at Eridu. A separate line of analysis emerged. From a study published in Scientific Reports, which examined ancient DNA from sites across the northern Iranian plateau, spanning from the Copper Age through the Sasanian period. The authors documented 3,000 years of genetic continuity across the eastern flank of the Zagros, meaning the population that had contributed ancestry to early Mesopotamian farmers remained largely in place throughout the entire span of Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Persian history. The people who had been the genetic donors to early Sumer never dispersed. Their descendants remain there today. The genetic relationship between the people who built the first cities and the people who inhabited the mountains that supplied those cities was not a single directional migration. It was a sustained, ongoing connection that persisted for the full duration of Mesopotamian civilization. This does not mean the Sumerian problem has been resolved. The 2022 papers do not identify a single source population for the Sumerians. There is no genomic moment that announces definitively where they originated. The picture is considerably more complex than that, and appropriately so. What the data does support is a complete reframing of the question. The Sumerians did not come from one place. They were the cultural endpoint of a process lasting thousands of years, during which populations moved and intermixed across the Fertile Crescent, with the largest single eastern contribution flowing in from the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran. There is a temptation, when findings like these emerge, to treat them as a kind of resolution. The mystery is solved, the science has spoken. The textbooks were wrong and are now being corrected. But that is not what the Lazaridis papers actually accomplish. They open a window rather than close one. The window they open reveals the understanding that ancient identities were almost certainly more fluid, more blended, and more interconnected than the modern tendency to sort people into national or ethnic categories has allowed us to appreciate. The Sumerians were not pure in any meaningful sense. Neither were the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Chinese, nor any other group that has ever constituted a people. Every civilization we now treat as a singular entity in the historical record was a composite of older populations layered across one another through thousands of years of movement and contact. The Sumerians were a particularly illuminating example of this precisely because they invented writing, which allowed them to record their own account of themselves. Those texts spoke of origin mountains, distant lands, and beings who arrived from elsewhere. Scholars interpreted those texts as myth for 2 centuries because the tools to read them as encoded memory did not yet exist. Those tools now exist. What ancient DNA is accomplishing, paper by paper and year by year, is the gradual transformation of old religious narratives into preserved records of movement. Not all of them, and not in precise detail, but enough of them in enough places that a pattern has emerged. The texts preserved knowledge that the textbooks did not. The mountains the Sumerians kept referencing turned out to be the mountains their ancestors had descended from. The gifts they described receiving at Eridu, the me of writing, mathematics, and metallurgy, may not have arrived from the heavens. They may have arrived from the convergence of populations whose meeting in southern Iraq produced something none of them could have achieved independently. That is the significance of the finding. Not a single foreign homeland, not a concealed prior civilization, simply a mountain range to the east that the Sumerians themselves never stopped naming, and a population whose contribution to the origins of civilization the science is only now beginning to fully measure. The Zagros samples continue to be analyzed. The Eridu samples have not yet been recovered. The southern Iraqi sites that would most definitively address the remaining questions lie in conflict zones, beneath modern cities, or behind excavation permits that have been pending for years. The work is slow and unglamorous. It does not produce the kinds of discoveries that attract broad public attention, but the textbooks are being quietly, paragraph by paragraph, rewritten.